Hi, I'm Barb.
Hi, I'm Pat.
Pat and I have a lot of interesting conversations.
Yes, and we thought you might like to listen in to our podcast that we've called Coffee House Inspirations.
We hope you will enjoy our topics.
Good morning. Hi, Barb.
Hi, Pat.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. I'm great. So we've been talking about what we'll chat about today. And we were having a discussion last week about triggers. And they're kind of emotional triggers, or some people call it getting your buttons pushed. And I think originally the idea of triggers came from the work being done on post-traumatic stress disorder for people who were either coming out of the military, or had some trauma in even the police force, or some people that are going to sea or whatever. And so they were discovering that there was after effects of trauma. So something would happen that was very traumatic, and the event would have passed, but people would still be triggered by certain things, and the emotions and the event would almost reoccur. So it'd be like a smaller event, but the same kind of intensity, and whatever the trigger was. And so as that study increased and expanded, it was really discovered that there were a lot of different traumas that weren't perhaps as severe or obvious as, say, a war trauma or an accident trauma, or a beating trauma, or that sort of thing. And that there could be events in people's lives that were still traumatic and producing some of the same effects as the traumatic events of the more extreme nature.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was a sort of a field of study that came out of that, and it moved into areas, some of it was where there was abuse, some of it where there was just dysfunction in families. There was, sort of a toxic family and children impacted, and then the impact shows up later on in life by certain triggers and that sort of thing. And so it's kind of a more common thing now. And when you say to someone, did that trigger you? People pretty much know what you're talking about. That it's not a like, people say, what do you mean trigger? But most people understand what that is. So
Mm-hmm.
you're talking to somebody, and they could use a tone, a voice tone, that triggers a memory of someone who had spoken badly to you or about you, and it will trigger the same kind of reaction and response that you had from the initial event.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing that even a tone of a person's voice can trigger something.
Yes, especially if it was, if the conversation, or that maybe it was somebody chastising, or somebody yelling at you, or the conversation was derogatory or whatever, that you might not remember so much of the details of the conversation, but you might remember the tone of the voice.
Mm-hmm.
And also, I think, they talk about a sound can trigger an event, or a smell, or something more tactile, like somebody touches you in a certain way and it triggers a memory of something else, like it's just a pat on the shoulder, or a nudge or something like that, and it triggers something in you, and it triggers an event that had an associated trauma to it. And so I think that it's kind of a interesting topic to have a look at, because we all have them at some level, and they are in varying intensity and in varying sort of related trauma, but I think we all have them.
I do too, to certain degrees. Yeah.
And so when you're triggered by something, or somebody, like we more commonly would say, somebody pushed your buttons, they may do it absolutely unintentionally, or they could do it intentionally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I think in the more common day-to-day things, it's often an unintentional event. If you're out and about and somebody says something to you, or even looks at you in a certain way, it will trigger some kind of memory of some kind. And so I think when we've talked about it, we're interested in almost not just the psychological aspect of it, but the physiological aspect of it, because it does something to your body.
Well, it gives you that, excuse me, I would say that it gives you that, a lot of times, that fight or flight reaction. Again, it's a survival thing. And especially in relationships, where a lot of times in relationships, if people are angry at each other, they will bring something up from the past, knowing that it's going to trigger you.
Mhm.
And it'll just get you in that survival mode right away, because it's usually the fight or flight. Because if you're in a big argument with someone, you either want to punch them or you just want to get out of there. So I mean, I would say that's probably the fight or flight. But
Yeah.
we've talked about this before, and so sometimes it feels like a punch to the stomach, and you and I have talked about it and described it as like a gunshot. Somebody's actually shot. You can sometimes just feel it hit you right in the chest.
Yeah.
That
And
emotion.
and even that has varying degrees. Sometimes it'll just be a small hit.
Yeah.
And sometimes it'll be something much more significant, where you would not have anticipated it, because it's not the event itself, that you recall. It's this other event, but it has the same kind of physiological impact in a way. I was looking at a really interesting study that was done, and it's interesting how wide the variety of things are that can actually trigger an emotional or physiological reaction in you. And there's a list of them here, and it kind of surprised me that it was so encompassing. At the top of the list is rejection.
Oh,
and
okay.
and betrayal, and unjust treatment, helplessness or loss of control, being excluded or ignored, disapproval or criticism, feeling unwanted or unneeded, feeling smothered or too needed, insecurity and loss of independence. And that covers a lot of territory.
Well, I just got a little mini trigger from something that you just said, which was the unjust treatment.
Yeah.
And that explains a lot why, like, I think we've talked about this before. Why does it bother me so much when I see, like, for instance, what's going on down in the States in their political area? It just bothers me so much. I mean, it bothers a lot of people, but it really feels like it's triggering me. And when you said that, I mean, we've talked about this before, and you described it as helplessness, but when you just said unjust treatment, I could feel that.
Yeah. And it's interesting, because you wouldn't have you're going along through a day, and you don't realize that there's even something like that going on until a phrase comes, or somebody says something, and your body is reacting as though there was something that just happened.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't really know the difference, because those triggers are very sort of hidden in the physiology or in our bodies. And it takes an event with a memory attached, and that's the trigger. And then it comes right through the whole system, whether it could be anxiety, or it could be a kind of a sense of dread, or a little bit of anger, or fear, and it all in varying degrees. But nonetheless, it's sitting in the body, kind of waiting for that kind of information to react to something like that. And this is so much of this, and it made me think of, as I was going through this list, it made me feel of kids that have been bullied, and they would have so many of these things, like helplessness or loss of control, being excluded or ignored, feeling unwanted or unneeded, insecurity. So you have, if you're in a situation where you've been bullied, it wouldn't take much to trigger some of that to some of that trauma that you would have absorbed during that when you were bullied. And it could come in so many different forms, and it could come from so many different sources and so unexpectedly. You could be sitting in a group with a group of friends, and somebody says something to you like that you would have recalled as some of the language that people used when they were bullying you, and you would automatically go into that kind of triggered reaction.
Well, I have there's a couple of people that I know that were bullied, and one is younger, one is older, and I still see signs of triggers from when they endured that, and they both react in totally different ways. One is a little bit more anger, and one has a bit of like wants to control things, because I think that makes them feel a bit safe. Would you agree with that? That if trying to control a situation would make you feel safer?
Sure. Yeah, and not even really knowing why. I mean, I think that there's a reaction that people have, and they are emotionally injured by something, and psychologically too. And so you start to kind of build things to protect yourself from something that you don't really even know you're doing. That's the part that I think that's the part that has a little bit of a key in it for resolution, is to understand what these triggers are, first of all. And secondly, to understand that what's in the body is the thing that you have to pay attention to, because the event that caused that is so long gone that you can't change that. You could maybe perhaps understand it differently, but you can't change it. So the work to be done, it seems to me, is how to manage your body when you're triggered.
So what would be some of the things, like if it's living in your body, and it's there, it's actually in the cells, it's in the memory of your cells of your body. What are some of the things that you could do to manage that, if that's what's going on, first of all?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the reactions that people have are much like physical anxiety. And your heart might start pounding, because you're in a flight or fright, like you said, you're in a fight or flight situation. So your body is getting ready to do something. And so your heart might start pounding, your stomach might get upset. You might feel shaky or a little weak, when you get really scared.
Yep, that's happened to me. Yep.
And your palms could start sweating.
Yeah.
So you're given some very clear clues that you're into something here. That
your body will let you know.
Your body will always let you know. And so that is another piece of the awareness, is to be aware of what's going on in your body. And that's where, we were talking about this before as well. That's where you have to own what's happening to you. Because if you externalize those events too much, you lose all control of it, because you're the one that's having the reaction.
So when you say externalize, do you mean like, excuse me, act out?
Well, I think more than maybe acting out, but blaming.
Okay.
Always looking at the person or event that triggered you as though the solution is there.
Okay. Yeah.
But that's never going to resolve what goes on in your body. And there are situations where people say and do things and you have to walk away from them, and that's a solution for the long term. But in the meantime, you still have to manage what goes on in your body, because that person has said or done what they're going to do or say, and they walk away and they're just fine. And you're left with this internal train wreck.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and then this person is walking away happy, and you're saying, wait a minute. because, and that's what I mean by you have to own it. You have to really own that it's going on for you, because that's where all your control is in how your response.
So then do you think you have to spend the rest of your life managing this? Like, because, if it comes up every single time, I mean, I can see where it would get, you could manage it to a degree that it's, manageable. But like, will it always be there? Will it always be triggering you?
Well, I think that there will always be some residual of it, but the key is what you manage it with.
Yeah.
So let's say somebody says something to me that says something like, you're stupid. And let's say that I grew up in a family where I was told I was stupid.
Mm-hmm.
And you would, by that time, you'd know how you feel. You'd feel small. You'd feel, kind of helpless, like there wasn't anything you could do about it. And, this was kind of a life sentence of stupid and all this kind of thing. And somebody then a lot later on in your life says, you're really stupid. And you don't even have a chance to react to what that was that somebody
Right.
said stupid about, because you've just dived headlong into the part where you've been triggered, and you dive headlong into that trauma of being told that you were stupid. So that you're not even thinking about how can I speak to this person, or let them know how I'm feeling, or put some parameters around talking to me like that, because you're deep in the trauma now. And so, like you've been saying, is when you're you've flipped into that kind of fight or flight, and your brain kind of turns off, and now you're just swimming around in this trauma where you're feeling small and weak and afraid and ashamed, and all of those things that goes into the into the cocktail of the trauma. And so that piece is so critical, where you have some understanding of when somebody says something to you that might have just been an offhand comment, that might have been they might have said something that would normally not affect anybody, and you are a puddle on the floor.
Yeah.
Because it hit you so hard. And so, without any awareness, you just automatically think that person was really evil, and what do I have to do, and blah blah blah. Or you could look at it as, how did I get so severely triggered by that comment? What was that? And then to understand that if for something to have that kind of an impact on you, something must have happened so that you would feel that extreme about what might have been an offhand comment.
And what if you're not aware? What if you're not aware that that's what that is?
Well, and I guess that's where you stay in that cycle.
The wheel.
Yeah, you stay in this wheel of you get on this, you go on the wheel of recovery, which is that you get mad, or you feel sad, or you think of all the things you should have done to that person, and left hook, right hook, blah blah, run away, whatever. And then a little bit of time passes, and you think, oh, well, I guess that's easing up a little bit. So you start to tell yourself, well, that's not such a big deal. And and then but you're still in that cycle where you don't really know what's going on. And you start to recover, and you're feeling that's good, and I don't know what happened there, but whatever. And you see the person again, and they haven't said a word to you. And you're a puddle on the floor, because you now they think you're stupid, and you're triggered.
Yes. Yeah. I'm just as you're talking, I'm looking at this picture of when you and I did our wheels, when we drew our wheels. And because we were talking about this one day, having coffee, and there's a picture of the trigger being pulled. So I've got a picture of a gun here, and I'm being shot, and it's usually unexpected and comes out of nowhere. and that's why it hits so hard. It can, for me, it hits the chest. That's where I feel it. And then you go from inflated to deflated. And this is just my reaction. So then you have a physical ache, shame, tremble, like you mentioned earlier, you can shake. So shame, tremble, angry, then you play it over and over again in your head. Sometimes you can go into victim mode, self-loathing. Will this ever change or get better? The feeling is familiar. You can't see a way out. And then you surrender to the hopelessness, make yourself smaller and hide. And then after a while, you just start to feel better. You do whatever it is that you need to do, whatever your program is to feel better, whether it's meditate or talk or whatever, just to get those feelings to go away. Right. They can be unhealthy, something unhealthy that you do, or something healthy that you do. Yeah. I'm sure there's a lot of people that drink or do drugs just to get those feelings to go away. Yeah. And then then it kind of starts all over again if you don't take care of it in a healthy way. Yes.
Yes. And so that's right. Because when we were talking about this originally, that getting on the wheel is not a good thing. You all the hamster on the wheel, because the hamster is just running in a circle and just it kind of either falls off or just kind of gives up,
gets tired.
And so the point is to how do you frame this in a better understanding or have enough kind of resources to not go onto that wheel where you're just trying to do whatever is required of you to recover from that trigger, because it will come again. And without some resolution, it will appear again, like you said, out of nowhere, and it'll surprise the hell out of you and take the legs right out from under you. And then you slowly recover yourself, but you haven't done anything yet to resolve what that trigger means.
So would you say that to resolve it or to take care of yourself, would you do the same things as you would to take care of like your anxiety, like when we talked about that in that other podcast?
Yes. So the first thing I think the first thing that is crucial is to understand when you've been triggered. And the thing about triggers is that it won't feel like anything new. If you get triggered, you'll go, oh yeah, I've had this before. I felt like that and that's right. So the first thing is to understand what a trigger is, that it has triggered something from a trauma in the past that has not been resolved. And sometimes it can't be resolved because that person might be dead and gone, or you might not have any contact with them, or whatever the case may be. And so there's that piece. And then the second piece is to understand what happens when we're triggered. And this is the things that we were talking about, what happens in the body. And that when that trigger turns into a stress reaction or an anxiety reaction, then now we're dealing with something going on in our body that will make it more difficult for us to resolve, because we're now embedded in the reaction itself. We now have the anxiety. We're trying to calm ourselves down. We're trying to find ways of self-talk so that we ease this a little bit.
Retaliation for some people.
Yeah. So that then that understanding that you've been transported back to an earlier time of a trauma that still remains in your body, and that it still has the same reactions. Now you've got a nice piece of work there to deal with. You've got the understanding of the stimulus and the response. So this trigger or stimulus has activated something in you that now the response is definitely in your body. And so that you just let time, we've let time take care of things. But when we understand that cycle of trigger and reaction, stimulus and response, now we can work with that differently. We can, when somebody says now I've got this understanding that this word stupid is so loaded for me that I can't control my reaction. And the next time that somebody says that, and they will, because, somebody will always say, don't be so stupid. Or,
Yeah.
I mean, not people we know, but, but
Nobody we know.
yeah, so, don't be so dumb. And you'll go, oh, that's the trigger. There's my trigger. And so you've removed yourself one step from that response. It may still respond. May be a response, but now you're aware of the trigger and aware of what it has typically done in your body.
And that's huge, isn't it? Just to be aware.
Huge. It's probably the single most important thing in dealing with these kind of things, because recognizing a trigger means that we have something in our history that has created a trauma that can be reactivated by just a word, by just a look, by a sound of some kind.
A tone, a look.
Yep, all those things. And that we can be thrown back into that original reactive, fearful mode. So that looking at all of the characteristics, or all of the anatomy of a trigger, is so important to know what happens to us, so that when somebody says something and we're feeling these things, like our heart's pounding, or our stomach is so upset and we're shaky, we're feeling kind of dizzy, knocked off balance, sweaty palms, that sort of thing. It can be in any level of extreme. Like, it can be just a little bit, or it can be a lot, but it's those kind of responses that will give us all the clues as to what happened. Because the event itself will not seem like it should have created that kind of reaction.
Right. Because you don't know where it came from. I know I've experienced, until I knew what it was, I've experienced those feelings in situations where, where you start to get shaky and palm sweaty, and if you don't know where it's coming from, if you think that it's happening because of the situation that's happening now, then you can really do a number on yourself and beat yourself up, thinking, why didn't I handle that better? Why couldn't I handle that? Not realizing that it's something that you've drugged from the past that is still affecting you. And then so what you do is you just beat yourself up over your response to this, seemingly not such a big deal situation.
Yeah.
And really can, like I said, do a number on yourself.
So what do you think would be different if you got a trigger like that, and now it's a trigger? What's the difference?
Well, just knowing that, I think you would probably still have a lot of the same responses, but knowing that that's where it's coming from, and that is the reason why you're feeling that way, you can be a little bit more gentle with yourself and understanding with yourself, and work it through. Yes,
I think you said something there that is super important, and that is that self-compassion. Because this didn't happen that day that you got triggered. It happened long ago. It in all likelihood happened at a time when you didn't or couldn't have control over it, so that you weren't able to, especially if you're a child and it requires an adult response, the likelihood of you coming up with that is pretty slim. And so you're now absorbing all of the feelings that went along with that. So that compassion for the self is so important, because we sort of blame ourselves for all the things that we don't like in our reactions and in the way we respond to things in the world. And it's not that we don't need to own them. It's just that we don't have to blame ourselves.
Right. Because you have that sense of weakness and helplessness. Yes. And then self-loathing because of it. Yes.
And so that I wanted to be really clear about that too, because it's not that we don't have to own it, because those feelings live in us, and that's what we have to own. We just don't have to own where they came from.
Right.
Because it might have been something that was so far out of our control, or I always think of the example of small kids that are bullied. There's very, very little resources that they would have had to deal with that. So the compassion that they need to have for themselves as they're working through those things as an adult is huge, huge amount of compassion.
I think that one of the things that happens, from these traumas as when you're a child, and one of the most hurtful ones is shame. So if you're shamed as a child, and if you're not allowed to express that in any way, you can't talk back. If you start crying, you're in trouble. Quit crying, or I'll give you something to cry about. And if you're not allowed to even express it, where does it go? It goes right into the body. And so as you're growing up, this shame is going to rear its ugly head in so many different situations. And unless you know that that's what it is, how are you going to know when you're a child? So as you get older, some people will figure it out with help or whatever. Some people won't.
Yeah.
And then you're just so vulnerable.
I agree with you totally. I think that shame is the number one most harmful burden that we carry as adults.
I agree.
And of course, picked up as children, but it's the number one, because it can color so much of the way that you feel like you have a right to respond to things that are happening in your life now. Because that once you trigger that shame in people, you pretty much got them on their knees. And so that ability to understand that as an adult, and to understand the triggers, and they can be on a huge spectrum of intensity, to get to a place where you can identify a trigger, have a sense that something is going on in your body, and then create this little space between the stimulus and the response. And voila, your freedom lies in that little space.
Yes.
Because then you break a cycle, and guess what? You get to jump off the wheel.
You get to jump off the wheel. That's why I love this quote from, I think it was from the movie Hope Floats. And at the end of the movie, she says, it was Sandra Bullock, she says, your childhood is something that you spend the rest of your life trying to overcome. That was great.
I think that for most people, that's probably the truth.
Yeah.
So I think we can kind of leave that there. I love this conversation because it gives us such a different ability to not be victimized by the responses that we have.
Exactly. That's good. But that's actually a good way of putting it. Victimized by our responses, because that's what is happening, isn't it?
Yeah.
We're being victimized by our own responses if we don't know.
Yeah. And that's kind of why that's why we call this podcast Who's Pulling Your Trigger?
Yeah. It's a good title.
Anyway, well, that's great. So we'll see you next time.
Okay. It's been a good conversation.
Awesome.
Thanks, Pat.